Greetings and welcome to The Movement with Kmt and Kofi Niles. Thank you for joining us. This show highlights the most important voices in the current Black movement for social justice. This is a chance for us to learn from the most insightful and impactful leaders in the community. Today we are here with Mr. DeRay Mckesson, who is a civil rights activist, podcaster, former school administrator, and he has been a leading voice in the Black Lives Matter movement. Mr. Mckesson has been active in protests around the country and on social media outlets. Mr. Mckesson regularly appears on networks such as MSNBC and CNN. And we are here with Principal Neal Currie, who is a school and community leader who founded and currently directs a Blue Ribbon School in New York. Principal Currie has received numerous awards for his activism and leadership. Mr. Mckesson, Principal Currie, welcome to the movement.
Thank you.
It's good to be here.
Mr. Mckesson, the Black community in the United States is facing multiple problems: police brutality, the miseducation of our young people, economic disparities, and horrible and quite limited images of us in the media. A couple of years ago, President Obama praised you for your work as a community activist. You now stand on the heels of people like Malcolm X and Fannie Lou Hamer and Dr. Frances Cress Welsing and a host of other major leaders, some of who are now ancestors. You have emerged as a leading voice in the Black community at such a time as this. What do you understand to be your responsibility, considering the voice and the platform that you have? And what is it like for you to have emerged in that position?
You know, I spend so much of my time immersed in issues of policing. Like, that is what I do all day. And it's interesting, people are like, why are you focused so much on the police? There are all these other issues, right? You should be doing prisons and jails and da-da-da. And what we remind people is that you can't name 3 ways you get to prison or jail that don't include a police officer, right? That the police are not like ancillary to this system. They are actually integral to how it works. And when we think about, you know, I used to be a teacher, and teaching was one of the best things I've ever done, but you got to be alive to learn. So, you know, we think about this as like a foundational issue. I'm also mindful that in the arc of civil rights, in the past 100-ish years, there is not a period of time where the police have gotten less power. They've only gotten more over time. Everything else we've gotten some good wins on. We got good wins on gay rights, women's rights, desegregation, healthcare, voting. We didn't get all of it, but we got wins. The police, literally over time, they just got more power, not less. When I think about what is our responsibility, we have a set of tools, we have a set of resources that just didn't exist before. We can build community quicker and pithier and scrappier than they had the tools and capacity to do before. You know, I can tweet and talk to 1 million people at the drop of a hat in a way that King and Fannie Lou Hamer, they just could not do. So I hope that we are able to put an end to this terror once and for all. Like, I hope that we're able to not only sort of end the violence of the police, but transition away from understanding police as key to public safety. That when we think about this issue, it really isn't a question of police or no police. That sort of binary is not one that I think that we can win in. The question is really rooted in an understanding that conflict will always be here. We can end poverty and a host of other ills, and there will be conflict between people. And some of that conflict will result in harm. The question for us becomes, who responds to the conflict? Who responds to the harm? The police are the easiest, laziest, and simplest response to that question, not the best. It took us a lot of time to figure out how to talk about the problem. So the police kill on average 1,100 people a year. The police actually kill more people in suburban communities than almost all other communities combined. It's not cities. Cities is actually the only place where there's a decrease. There's a 30% decrease from 2013 to today in cities. Everywhere else across the country, it's increasing. Suburban and rural communities is going up. The difference between suburban communities and urban is huge. It's not close at all. So it took us a while to try and figure out like how to talk about it. There are 8 US cities in the top 100 cities where a Black man is more likely to be killed by a police officer than anyone is likely to be killed by anyone else across the country. So that was the first step. Like, what is the what? There's no data before 2013, so if you got killed by a police officer before 2013, we don't know. And if you get killed today by a police officer and a newspaper doesn't write about it, we also don't know. So much of it was like, how do we understand like the contours? 18,000 police departments, 2.2 million people incarcerated, only 200,000 of those people are incarcerated in federal prisons. almost all the terror that people experience is local and state. It is like your mayor, it's your governor, it's your city council person. Like it's not, the federal government becomes the boogeyman, but you could let everybody out of federal prison tomorrow and it won't make a dent in like the landscape of mass incarceration. So the problem was the first part. And then it was like, okay, now that I get the problem, like what are solutions? Like how do we help people think about solutions? If we know the solutions will be local, like the federal government really doesn't, the federal government can do some things uniquely, healthcare, like social security, those sort of things. Policing is really local. The worst thing the federal government can do is either model bad laws, insert the crime bill, and that modeling got adopted by cities, or push money to cities to incentivize certain bad practices, but they can't actually legislate it, which is good for us for the most part. So what keeps me hopeful and like what it is like to be in the work is every day we're just trying to figure out like, how do we help people in their community do the thing? So we organize with a 3-part frame that there's a really big problem, the problem is close to you, and you can do something about it. So we're like, the police union contract is bad, here's how it's bad in your community. Like, here are some strategies that you can employ. And like, we do that over and over. The last thing I'll say is that, you know, you've heard the phrase, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. There's a version of that that says one bite after another, and we don't believe that. That's incrementalism. What we know is that the elephant will heal if we wait too long. We believe that it's everybody biting at the same time, that this has to be like a full court press is the only way that we'll win. So it's like all the strategies at play at once is what we believe.
So the work of the community and leadership should be whatever it is that they're good at, whatever your way is, whatever it is that you're good at, you should be doing that work.
Yeah, and like rooted in system stuff. So it should be like the end of solitary confinement, like fines and fees, the end of criminal and civil asset forfeiture, like no more no-knock raids. Like it is fighting for all of those things at the same time, right? Like not one campaign in January, then we do something else in July, and then we do, like the system, I mean, this is what systems do. Systems like, they bounce back. That is like that's why they're systems. So part of our work is like to put so much pressure in these really concrete ways that we get changes. So we did a campaign called 8 Can't Wait around use of force. It's the single biggest reduction in the power of the police in U.S. history. But we even know that is like the floor, not the ceiling. That's not good enough, right? Like that's a beginning. We're doing police union contracts, but it's all of these things. It's the budgets. It's all of them working at once because there's no one strategy that'll get us to zero. You know, like no one thing is like the magic bullet, which is the same about education, is that there's not like one thing that suddenly makes everybody learn. It is like classroom culture, and it is home, and it is the external factors, and it's the curriculum, right? It actually has to be all the things at once, and I think that what we learned, and I'll be interested to hear from Neal, I think that what we learned, especially over the last 20 years in ed reform, is that the people telling us that it was the one thing, they were wrong. It isn't just teacher quality, it isn't just principles, right? It isn't just classroom culture. And I think we actually see that in all of organizing. Like it's not just moving the money away from policing, like it is all of these things at once.
I see. Principal Currie, you're the founder and principal of a long-standing charter school. Yes. From your perspective, what should be the work of the people in the communities? What is it that we should be doing? Because you have to work with Black children all day long. You've got something very important that you're looking at all day long, the most important aspect of our community.
Yes.
What is it that should be our work?
So as African people, what do I think our goal should be? So I think that's where I start. So I think our goal should be to restore our people back to the condition that we were in prior to our homeland being invaded, colonized, millions of our people being enslaved and dispersed throughout the world. So I think we have to have the goal of trying to restore ourselves back to being a free, independent, sovereign, and self-determining people. And so everything that we do should be around that goal. So how do we get there? So of course we want to make sure that we have to dismantle the system of white supremacy and all of its manifestations. And that's a huge elephant, as DeRay mentioned. But we have to recognize first that we are an African people, that we are a global people, that people are going through the same things that we're going through all around the world. And that we have to be focused on that mind. So I'm concerned that if we do not have clear focus on what the goal is, the ultimate objective, that some of these concessions that we get will be misinformed and to think that we're making progress or that we are achieving victories that we're not achieving yet. So I think for me, I think it all begins with education. It all begins with informing people. This is what has been so wonderful about the Black Lives Matter movement, is that it raised awareness to people. It made people come alive in terms of understanding what the problems were. So it starts with education, but we need to be making sure that we are building young people to be able to take on the mantle of this vision that we have for a new society.
I'd like to ask both of you to take a listen to a brief clip of Malcolm X in 1963 and get your opinion on it.
What you and I need to do is learn to forget our differences. When we come together, we don't come together as Baptists or Methodists. You don't catch hell because you're a Baptist, and you don't catch hell because you're a Methodist. You don't catch hell because you're a Methodist or a Baptist. You don't catch hell because you're a Democrat or a Republican. You don't catch hell because you're a Mason or an Elk. And you sure don't catch hell because you're an American, because if you was an American, you wouldn't catch no hell. You catch hell because you're a black man.
Is what Malcolm X said in 1963 still true today? Principal Currie, do we catch hell because we're black? And also, what do you see as being the most and the biggest impediment to black progress today?
Yeah, I think unfortunately what Malcolm talked about in 1963 still is true today. I think for the most part, that is the main reason that we are catching hell. And I think we have to make sure that we understand what we have in common as a people. And so I think that's what his point really was. I mean, our main impediment to our progress today, I think, is the issue of power. I mean, we want control over our lives and our destiny, and I think that's really the main issue. I think we have to be clear about what the source of our problem is white supremacy, and we have to have a good understanding of that. As Neal Currie said, if you don't understand white supremacy, then everything else you think you understand will only confuse you. I think we have to make sure that we are unified. There's a lot of, sometimes we can be working at cross purposes if we're not unified. So I think we also have a lack of knowledge of self. We have to have a clear understanding of our history and our culture, and then make sure that we are adapting strategies and tactics that are consistent with that to envision that. But I really think the core issue is about power. I think this is what we are trying to fight for, is to have power over our lives.
You said something interesting there. If you don't understand white supremacy, everything else you think you understand will only serve to confuse you. Help us understand that a little more.
Yeah, I think so. What we know is that this is kind of something that you hear often about, the phrase white supremacy. And when I'm talking about white supremacy, I'm really talking about the systematic aspects of white supremacy, not so much attitudes of one group of people thinking they're better than another group of people, but I'm really talking about the subjugation of groups of people in all different areas of activity based on the concept of race and racism. And we know that this system of white supremacy has many manifestations, and it stretches itself all across the globe. So you can't fight in one place, you can't only fight in one area, because it's interlocking and it's a spider web that is really all the way across the globe. So without understanding that, I think that you will be confused about what you think you're working on and what you think you're achieving.
Interesting. And how do you help your students in the school? I mean, how do you get that across to students in the school? How do you help them understand the system?
Well, you know, I'm in elementary school, so I think we try not to overwhelm them so quickly about that, but I do think it's important that if we are envisioning a world where we are a sovereign people, then we need to start preparing those young people for that. So I think they need to be aware of what's happening. They are aware of what's happening. You know, they're not isolated. They're on social media, they're watching television, they're listening to their parents and people in the community speak. So they know that there are problems that are going on. They have thoughts and ideas about those problems. We need to be talking with them about those and helping them to craft solutions and to be involved in that. And if the curriculum isn't doing that, if it isn't helping make those connections for scholars to figure out how they are understanding their world and interpreting the reality around them, then we're not doing our jobs well, and we're not going to be preparing people to be in a position to do what we need them to do.
You said something else that I think needs maybe some fleshing out. You said our sovereignty. What does that mean?
Well, I think we want to be a self-governing people. We want to be free. We want to be independent. We want to have the power to determine our own lives. We need to have control over the institutions, the life-sustaining institutions that are in our community, to dictate that. This type of society that we want to live in. I think we want to make sure that those institutions are operating from a frame of reference, from a theory, from a methodology that is rooted in our own historical and cultural reality and worldview. Sometimes we will adopt solutions or things that are not consistent with our cultural values, and so we have people in our community that can design those systems. We have to believe it's possible. I think that's another impediment is lack of belief in ourselves and what's possible.
Lack of belief in ourselves and what's possible. I understand. Mr. Mckesson, do we catch hell because we're black? Is Malcolm X still correct today? And what do you believe to be the biggest impediment to black progress?
Yeah, so I think that he is correct. I would add like an and. I think that one of the things that's been beautiful about this moment is that we have started to talk about the multiple ways that people's identities are shaped and expressed and what that means. So people are catching hell because they are black and queer and black and women and black and poor and black, the complexity of identity is actually really important. And when we think about moments around policing, we are fighting the institution of policing as much as we are fighting the logic of policing. And the logic of policing says there are people who set norms and standards and we enforce them in community. That's what the police do. They do it violently towards people of color and poor people. That hence the problem. But what is homophobia but a set of norms about what it means to be straight that we're actually enforcing on people violently and in terroristic ways, right? What is transphobia but a set of norms that is set on people about what it means to be heteronormative, and then we are enforcing that on people who are outside of that, right? So like we are trying to disrupt the logic of policing as much as the institution of policing. So I think the spirit of the comment is right. I do think that the system bears down on people differently given the complexity of identity. Now, when I think about the biggest inhibitor, it is the system of white supremacy. It is like, what does it mean when you look up and know that the system was literally not designed for you? Every version of a metric we could look at, black people do worse, and that is not happenstance, that's by design, right? The thing though, is remember that people built this, like people did this. Like this isn't like a natural creation, like people did it. And because people did it, we can do something better, like we believe that. So when we think about this idea of self-sufficiency, when we think about what it means to have community control, it is an understanding that people have always been smart enough in their own communities to make decisions for themselves. Have they always had resources? No. Have they always been supported? No. Have they always been trusted? No. But have they been capable? Yes, right? And part of the work of organizers is to, we can't give people power. I can't like come into your neighborhood and like give you power. What I can do is remind you of the power you've always had, right? Like that is what the best organizers do, is say like, hey, system's designed to make you think that like you don't mean anything, vote doesn't matter, voice doesn't matter. And what we do is like help you see that. So even around the election time, people are like, no politician has ever mattered to me, voting doesn't touch me. And I'm like, I'm from Baltimore, I live in Baltimore. If you know anybody who like couldn't get a drug treatment spot, that was somebody elected, like allocated those funds somewhere else. If you know anybody ever sentenced to a crime, all the judges we got are elected. Like you actually do know, you don't know that you know this, but like you have interacted with a ton of people who were elected. You just didn't, it's a real disadvantage about our political education of people in community that like you think that the only elected people are like the mayor, like it's like we're electing the register of wills. If you got divorced, that like somebody chose all of these people and the somebody was you.
Mr. Mckesson, I want to show our viewers a picture of you that was published in the Baltimore Sun in 2016. In this picture, you are being arrested in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. You've been very outspoken about police violence, and you once said, "What does it mean that we live in a country where a third of all people killed by strangers are killed by a police officer?" Can you help us better understand that statement? And how can black people use what you share to better comprehend our relationship to the United States?
Yeah, a third of all the people killed by strangers, killed by a police officer, that's wild. I think, the truth should radicalize you. Like, you should need to see 10 more videos or, like, go to another lecture. Like, just understanding that, like, this is happening should be enough to be like, wow, that's really wild. We think about places like Phoenix. In Phoenix, Arizona, 1 in 5 homicides a couple years ago was committed by an officer. In Albuquerque, 1 in 3 homicides was committed by an officer. That this is actually like a much greater problem than most people understand. And when you think about convictions, you know, if the police kill 1,100 people a year on average, the highest number of convictions for any of those killings in a given year is 11. That is wild, you know? It's like when people say things like accountability, I'm like 11 is the highest. 11 is like, it's 11, then 9, and then it just gets worse. One is sort of where we land in most years. So like, that's sort of wild. And I think that the disconnect for me when people aren't, I don't know, intense about it is like they died. You know, this is not like, oh, you know, traffic tickets or like the number of people shot with beanbag guns. Like those, I'd be like, you know, I get why you're not like, I don't know, worked up about it. But it's like the people died. That's a lot of people to kill every year, and people are very like blasé about it as like a public policy issue or as like a public health issue. That seems sort of wild to me. So when I think about this question of our relationship to the country, again, I'm reminded that the police are one of the most durable institutions, one of the most enduring institutions, and the propaganda around policing is just really baked in. That like, you can't name a show where the police were the bad guys. You can't name a show where internal affairs weren't the good guys, or like internal affairs were the bad guys. You can't name a show where like the internal affairs people, even when they exist, aren't like the villains. You know, like just the idea of accountability is actually sort of like we mock it in mass media. And then you think about things like Zootopia, which you know, you probably have seen. Have you seen Zootopia? No, with kids. It's an animated film, but the main characters are police. It's like a popular animated film, and there's a moment in the film where she's like trying to. It's like the main character is a police officer. She's trying to find the bad guy, and she like destroys the neighborhood. Just straight up, she like runs through it, destroys this entire community, but it's like in the name of justice. And like that is just such a great example of like how the narrative around policing works. So when, you know, somebody gets killed, it's like, oh, that's an aberration, that doesn't, and it's like, these are only the killings we know. You know, we don't have any data about the violence of the police that doesn't result in death. You know, like there's a host of, so I think that the policing issue reminds us that our relationship with this country is one not rooted in justice and equity. One that has a long way to go, and I do believe that if we figure out how to break this system, we can sort of break anything. That like, because the police are the enforcers of the norms and standards, that if we change this, I think we actually change way more than we believe. And you know, the police's only response is fear. So like when we're like, there should be accountability, they're like, well, crime's gonna increase. And you know, we even look to the FBI statistics, only 5% of the arrests that happen in the United States happen for violent crime. And that has been the same for 20 years. Like, not increasing, not huge, like, but you would know that if you watch TV, you know, crime sells on TV, and like cops and live PD, like we have just mythologized and pathologized communities of color to be these crime-ridden. You know, people don't realize that black people are least likely to be armed in the presence of the police. White people are more likely to be armed. Like, and you know that black people aren't like pointing guns at police, like in any neighborhood, you know, like that's not happening, but people believe it. So we spend so much time like helping black people both understand like what is true and what's not true, helping policymakers understand like what is possible, and then fighting for it.
And you mentioned something, you mentioned policy. A lot of people think that what we need is more policy, but there are policies against killing unarmed men. There are policies against some of the practices that we see the police actually implementing, but yet they still do it. Is policy the way forward, or do we need a different strategy besides just trying to pass policies that are already on the books but are not being enforced or followed, that lack of accountability?
Yeah, so two things. One is there is no one strategy that'll get us to zero, right? So like policies alone won't do it, the budget alone won't do it, like it'll always be a both and. But the second is sort of a challenge, is that there actually aren't these policies. I think that people think they're policies because that makes sense, like you should think that because like that would make sense, but there aren't. So like when we started this project in 2015, we were trying to figure out what are the use of force policies in communities, right? Like what are the rules about which the officers can use force? And what we found is that in the 100 largest cities, only 27 of the 100 largest cities ban neck restraint, so like chokeholds, things like that. Whereas when we ask people are like, yeah, chokeholds have been bad for a long time. You're like, they're not. Like this is, you know, I talked to one of the senator's chief of staffs who worked on the George Floyd bill, And he's like, yeah, we're just gonna like codify this, but like we already banned chokeholds a long time ago. It's like, we didn't. That's not true. You know, people think we did because like, I don't know, they saw like a movie or something, but like we didn't, you know? And when you look at a lot of the policies, and this is like a project that we have done recently, which is why I know a lot about it, but I've read a gazillion use of force policies, is a lot of them say things like, you know, officers can use deadly force if there's like imminent danger, blah, blah, blah. You're like, okay, cool. Like if most people are like, if somebody's trying to kill you, you can save yourself. People get that. But then it'll say something like, you can use deadly force if the person attempted to use deadly force with a deadly weapon. And you're like, okay. But when you slow that down, that is in the past tense, right? So that means that I could rob a bank with a gun, drop the gun, and walk outside. That would meet that second bar of like, I did use a deadly weapon to commit a crime in the past. And like in a lot of cities in the United States, the policy would allow the officer to kill that person. Not an active threat, didn't hurt anybody, but like they had done something. Oregon's a great example of a state where the law says that an officer can use deadly force if they think a felony was committed or if they think a felony is about to be committed. You're like, that's why, you know, in most places, felony theft is theft over $1,000. So if I think you just stole a cell phone, I can kill you. That's wild, right? You know, the policy actually protects them way more than it protects the people. So I don't think that is a silver bullet. I do think that that moves the needle. And when you talk about firing bad cops or I don't know how you do that without putting some rules and standards in the first place, right? And that, like, do I believe that policy alone will change everything? No. I also know that if we aren't in the room, we, the movement people, aren't in the room, the only other people in the room are the police. And I certainly don't want my opponent writing the rules for themselves.
Principal Currie, any response to what Mr. Mckesson just shared?
Yeah, a couple of things kind of struck me. I think your initial question was about our relationship to the country and what policing tells us about our relationship to the country. And what it made me think of was our relationship to the country is still the original relationship that we originally had with the country. And that was and how policing got started was really to control the enslaved population. You had the paddy rollers, whose responsibility it was to keep the enslaved folks on the plantation, run back and catch them and that kind of thing. And so our relationship to the country is the same that it's always been. You know, some people would characterize that as an internal domestic colony, and the police are enforcing, that relationship to us, and that still continues today. And I think most Black people in urban communities feel that way. They feel that the police are more of an occupying force, and is there to control them. So I think we have to start to think, and I say we, I'm talking about African people, about our relationship with the country. And then what do we do about that relationship? And so I think I'm thinking that we need to begin to think about solutions that go outside of these things. I think policy, definitely we have to advocate for changes in policy. We have to protest, but at a certain point we have to stop making appeals to folks and work on a longer term solutions, what Malcolm once said, permanent solutions. Because policies can change, we've seen that happen. We legislate one thing and then the next administration comes in and takes it out. So we need to be looking at longer term solutions for our problems.
You're an educator. Can you help us understand the relationship Black children have to these United States?
Wow, that's a heavy question. Yeah, so I think the same relationship that their parents have. You know what I mean? I think we know about Black children in schools. We know that they're more likely to be in schools that are underfinanced. We know that they're less likely to graduate. We know that they're less likely to be in classes that prepare them for college. We know that they're more likely to be suspended or expelled from school. We know all of those things. But I think the real challenge with our schools is, because despite all of those things, despite majority of Black children going to schools that are not designed for them, we still have millions that thrive under those conditions, right? And they end up going to college and end up doing well. The problem is as Carter G. Woodson pointed out to us in 1933, they come out on the other end often miseducated and misoriented. And what I mean by that, even if they're highly educated, we often don't get the benefit of them applying those skills and that knowledge to helping our communities get better. So when I think about all these places around the country where you see these universities and schools, some of them are excellent institutions, but what do the communities around those places look like? And have we been able to see any impact of having a great school, what it does for the community? And I think that would be because those schools are not designed to teach people how to solve problems that are affecting the communities where those folks come from. And I think that's what we need to be looking for to do. And that starts early. It starts as early as elementary school for us to be contemplating those issues and understanding for children to understand their surroundings, and then to get the skills and knowledge that they need to eventually work on solving those problems.
What you said there is important. You know, one of the things that I've heard more and more people doing is trying to articulate the situation as a war, and that the police would be sort of like a front line in that war, the front line for the system of white supremacy. Do you think that's helpful language, or is it better to not use language like there's a war on the black community? Is it, in your opinion, what language do we use, and is that the right language to use to help like children understand what's going on in black communities?
Most of the metaphors worry me, so I try to just say like what is happening. I don't think this is like I don't like the sports metaphor, like we're in a race for our lives. I don't like that, you know, like that feels really gamey to me. I don't like the war stuff. Makes it seem like we are equally armed and equipped, and we're not. So I don't like the war metaphors, right? If anything, this is like more akin to genocide. Like it is, there's one side that has like the weight of the government, and then there's another side that does not, right? So that to me isn't war per se. War, I think, sort of leads people to believe that like these two parties came with like the same set of whatever, and like one, I mean, you think about enslavement, that was genocide, right? That was like a lot of power on people without a lot of power, and like I think that our language should reflect that. So when I talk about it, I normally try to talk about the impact, that it is wild to me that the police kill 1,100 people a year. It is wild to me that the highest number of convictions in a year has ever been 11. It's wild to me that a third of all the people killed by strangers killed by, right? Like, that's sort of just like what is happening is actually so wild that we should do something about it. But the metaphors, I haven't settled on one where I'm like, I think that actually says it.
I understand. You don't think the war language would make black people sort of feel like, well, maybe I should take this more seriously. Maybe we should figure out some kind of a way to get ourselves.
I think people do take it. The seriously thing I also worry about, it's like, nobody needs to go to like this is not about trust, right? Like nobody needs to, we don't need to have black youth come to another listening session with the police or town hall. They know they are the terror. They don't need to hear from the kids. They are it. Like they know it, you know what I mean? Like we're like performing this ritual that makes it seem like community did something wrong and the police did something wrong. We need to repair trust. It's like, no, you beat up people, and like my responsibility is not to like go tell the bully that like I'm a good person. The bully needs, like, the onus is completely on that person. It's not on me. So I worry about any language that veers towards this idea of like mending relationships. It's like everybody be fine if you weren't killing people and terrorizing people in the community, but that is actually what you're doing, and that's not a we thing. Like we didn't do that. You did that. I am responding to it. I think what I am continually shocked by is how death is minimized. Like if people are dying. If people weren't dying, I think I'd be like, oh, like people, I don't know, had a bad encounter maybe. But you're like, people are dying, and our response is like, oh, that was another killing today. And it's like, that to me is really wild.
Principal Currie, what do you have to say about this? Are you the idea of it being a war? We just heard from DeRay Mckesson that there's some ways that may not be so helpful. I'm wanting to know what you think.
Yeah, I'm not really sure about that. I know that there are a lot of casualties of the war. So I would think of the war on black people as being broader than just interactions with police. I mean, if you would think of, you could think about it from, if you go back to enslavement, a group of people invaded a land and kidnapped folks and colonized the land. That is, in a sense, an act of war. So if we continue to have over the last 500 years casualties and death precipitated as a result of that first encounter, then you could say that the war never stopped. But in terms of using that language to help people better understand the police thing. I mean, I kind of think that I'm really thinking more that the police is a result of something else. Like, what is the core problem? And I'm curious as to, since you spend most of your time organizing around police, what do you see as the core issue? Like, what is the actual problem? Is policing a symptom, or is policing the actual issue?
I think it is. So, to the war question, I'd say I just can't think of any war where black people were implicated where we weren't severely harmed in the process. It's like the war on drugs was bad for black people. The war on poverty hasn't been like some, massive success either, right? So the war language, I think, has not really helped us, even in places where people are like, this is gonna help community. We're like, yeah, the war on drugs did not like make communities better, it like ruined communities. So that's why I get worried about war. But I do think the police are like their own. I think the police want us to believe that they're like wrapped up in some larger thing and like that they are like a symptom of something. I think the police are like interestingly a key part of it. So when we look at, it's something like 50% of all overturned convictions are a result of police misconduct, right? We look at when we look at things like that over time, and you're like, the police are just not an ancillary part of this. They are like a key driver in a host of things that we think about. So I think about what does it mean to enforce a set of rules that you did not create. Like, that is how I think about policing. And those rules are awful, but they only matter because like somebody is like holding people to them, and the police are the apparatus that does that, right? And they have a choice not to do that in white community. I mean, they have a choice to not do that in every community, but they choose to do it in ours in ways that are like really wild. So the thing that I'm always mindful of with the police is like, they are their own terror, period, and they can't do it alone, right? There's like a whole apparatus of like laws and that like enable it, encourage it, protect it, and I think that is like what I'm never lost on. So with this question about policy, it's like, it is real. Or you think about coroners. It's like, you all know what a coroner is. They decide the cause of death. There are only 4 states that require the coroner to be an elected official. I mean, to be a medical professional. The rest of the states don't. And why does that matter when we talk about race? It's like, there's a whole period of Jim Crow where the coroners in the South particularly were like random people. So when lynchings happened, they would be like, oh, he died in his sleep. This is suicide. You're like, no. So like, it doesn't show up as murder, right? Like, they just figured out how to reconfigure the system in ways that mask the truth at such epic levels. And that is like, in California, most of the coroners are sheriffs. So they don't have a vested interest in saying like somebody died in their jail, because like, it's their jail. And like, that to me just is so deep-seated, so insidious, like working at a level that normally does not it doesn't break the news, and it doesn't, that like, I do think of them as their like own unique thing.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the police are absolutely very powerful, too powerful, but they're satisfying a function for the state, so that somebody wants them to have. So you know what I mean? And as a result of that, then they're given, the carte blanche to do what they need to do to enforce a particular order or status quo. So I don't know if, so we definitely have to try to reform policy. We need to protest. We need to show resistance to that as a way of creating space for ourselves to be able to work on what we really need to be working on. And that is building our communities. And so we can't do that when we're under attack. And so I think sometimes we could get caught into the cycle of continually protesting and making appeals to the government when we already understand what our relationship is to the state, because that hasn't changed. That's been the one thing constant. Now over time, so there'll be ebbs and flows of how that goes. So I'm wondering if we're not focused on the right thing at times.
I do think this idea of like our relationship to the government, I'm always mindful that there is no this without us, right? Mm-hmm. So like, this idea of like appealing to the oppressor, like I get it, like that makes sense to me. I've definitely heard it. I'm also mindful that like part of it is about saying like, this is ours, right? So this is not only an appeal to the bad guys, this is like a reclamation of something that was always ours and doesn't exist without us, right? So when I think about people like protesting and fighting, like it is not, you know, I never think about my work as like trying to convince the white supremacists that this is like a noble mission. Like we think about it as saying like, you know what, this is like none of the wealth of this country, none of that, like none of it would exist without indigenous people and black people. Like,
Right.
So that some of the fight is actually like is like a naming of that, is like a reclaiming of that, is a saying like, I'm not gonna cede like the authority I have to these institutions or to make the institutions better or to own the institutions, given that like you wouldn't even be able to engage in this project without us. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I mean, I agree with that to an extent. And I think, but I guess the way I would look at it differently, because all of what you said is true. I don't disagree with any of that. But toward what ends? So what I mean by making an appeal, it seems to be that we're still in the end, what are we asking for? We're asking for inclusion, we're asking, you know, what is it that we're asking for? As opposed to saying we're asking to be self-determining people. You know what I mean? We're asking to be sovereign in our own right. And which means that some of this is ours. Some of these resources that have been accumulated is the result of our labor, of our work. And we need to be able to reclaim that, but toward what end? And so that's what I'm concerned about in terms of the movement in general. To use that phrase, is what exactly are we fighting? Are we fighting for in the end? And I think there's some confusion around that in terms of what's possible. You know what I mean? So this idea, you know, because there are, you know, folks have said that, you know, until Africa is strong, like we're not going to be okay here in America, even if all of these reforms that we're fighting for happen. And our folks around the world are not going to be okay, because same things that's happening here are happening on the continent and other places in the world as a result of the policies that this government is doing everywhere. So that's what I'm concerned about in terms of us having clarity on that. And sometimes it's hard to tell that.
I want to play a brief clip from 30 years ago. It's of an audience member on a talk show. After the clip, I want to come back to you, Mr. Mckesson, with the question.
Would you explain why it is relevant at this stage in 1990, with all that we've gone through, why it is still relevant to try and to educate or to get white people to understand the plight of black people? Shouldn't the energy be directed to us?
Mr. Mckesson, some black activists are focusing much of their energy on trying to change white people. Concurrently, there are some black people in the community who have suggested that black people should spend their time transforming themselves and their community. This is a two-part question. The first part, should black activists continue to spend time trying to change white people? That's part one. And part two, what steps can black people take to strengthen themselves and their group so that when outsiders harm their community, they can use their collective power to make sure there is a just response?
Yeah, so I think ideally white people would be organizing white people, like taking the labor and like the time and explain things and stuff like that. I think normally that comes in an umbrella created by black activists. So it is like black activists sort of painting sort of what the horizon looks like, what the big goals are like, and then helping white people organize themselves so that like that doesn't become the burden of teaching people experiences and systems and things like that. So I think that's best case scenario, and I think that works. I think that there are a lot of white people who want to do good, don't know what good looks like. There are people who do stand in solidarity and are ready to use their influence, don't really know what that means in practice, because we are often fighting systems that impact us in dramatically different ways than they impact them. So there's like a teaching there, and there's like an understanding and like a sort of how to use your privilege. So I think about even in the last set of protests, there are some white people who are like, we actually don't need you in the street, don't come. You can just call the governor, call and yell. Like if that's your cousin or your buddy or your whoever, like we're outside the house trying to get them to do whatever, but if you can get in the house and yell, do that. You know, like we can actually fight this battle in a host of ways. And so people say people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And like, I don't actually know if that's true. Like I think that people closest to the problem are closest to the problem.
Principal Currie, any response to that?
I mean, I do think, as I mentioned earlier, there has to be a two-pronged approach. I mean, I think we have to advocate, protest, and at the same time build for the future. So I'm concerned that we are not spending enough time building for the future, seeking a long-term permanent solution. So I think there are different roles to play. So we need people in the street when it's time to get in the street, and we need people strategizing and doing other things. We need people building institutions and running them. So if you're building institutions and you're running them, then you don't have time to do some other things. So I think we need John Henry Clark said, we need to use everything that touches our lives religiously, socially, politically, culturally for our liberation. If it's not of use for our liberation, then we should throw it in the trash can. So I think that's the approach that we need to be taking.
You mentioned building for the future. I want to show you a clip.
Been through it, would you? It might be interesting to judge people today by the color of their eyes. Would you like to try this? Yeah! Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Since I'm the teacher and I have blue eyes, I think maybe the blue-eyed people should be on top the first day.
Up here?
I mean, the blue-eyed people are the better people in this room. Oh, yes, they are. Blue-eyed people are smarter than brown-eyed people.
My dad isn't that stupid.
Is your dad brown-eyed?
Yeah.
One day you came to school and you told us that he kicked you.
He did.
Do you think a blue-eyed father would kick his son?
Yeah.
My dad's blue-eyed. He's never kicked me. Greg's dad is blue-eyed. He's never kicked him. Rex's dad is blue-eyed. He's never kicked him. This is a fact. Blue-eyed people are better than brown-eyed people. Are you brown-eyed or blue-eyed?
Blue.
Why are you shaking your head?
I don't know.
Are you sure that you're right? Why? What makes you so sure that you're right?
I don't know.
The blue-eyed people get 5 extra minutes of recess, while the brown-eyed people have to stay in. The brown-eyed people do not get to use the drinking fountain. You'll have to use the paper cups. You brown-eyed people are not to play with the blue-eyed people on the playground because you are not as good as blue-eyed people. Well, the brown-eyed people in this room today are going to wear collars so that we can tell from a distance what color your eyes are.
Principal Currie, instead of blue versus brown eyes, black children are normally taught black versus white skin. There are some scholars who suggest that black children are exposed to a Eurocentric curriculum in schools, and that curriculum centers Europeans and teaches that black people or African people have not contributed much to human history or humanity in general. Can you help us understand what is a Eurocentric curriculum? And based on your educational experience, can you help us understand what type of curriculum do you believe black children must be exposed to if they are to develop a strong sense of their history and culture?
Well, thank you for that question. I think, clearly we want schools and learning to center the person that is being taught. So what we mean by centered is that they are subjects of what's going on and not bystanders. So oftentimes in schools, or oftentimes in the curriculum, we're learning about other people's great accomplishments. Again, I quote the great Carter G. Woodson in 1933. He wrote that the education system benefits so many others more than it benefits the Negro because they learn about the great accomplishments of other groups of people, and then by default are left to wonder, well, what did I accomplish? And so I think it's very, very important for our children to know of the great accomplishments that our people have done, and that they play a critical role in the world, in the development of the world. And in fact, we are the mothers and fathers of civilization, the first human beings to walk the planet, and that as a result of that, we have a great responsibility to the world now. And I think when you see children understanding that, then they know that there's nothing that they can't accomplish in this time. So we want schools that are designed around that center our children in their own history and their culture, and also give them the idea that there's nothing that they can't accomplish in the modern context.
And Mr. Mckesson, you are a former educator. Just based on your experience as an educator and in schools in New York and in other places, what have you seen in relationship to the curriculum and the ways in which we can either modify it or possibly expose Black children to a curriculum that works better for them?
Yeah, so we look at the disproportionate impact that Texas, for instance, has on the construction of school textbooks, and how when they want to chop out whole parts of history, or say the Civil War wasn't about race, but it was the war between the states, that actually shapes the way that a whole group of young people start to learn about the past, and it skews them. We also, we go into schools and we're like, well, how many non-white authors are kids exposed to in English classes, in social studies, right? Like, do we, not only Black people, like, are they reading any Native American, who is not white that they are reading like a literary text about? Like, doing these audits so we can help schools understand, like, yeah, we can't actually teach young people a history of the world that is only through the eyes of white people, that is actually a political choice, and one that doesn't make sense when you think about building a world of equity and justice and joy.
And you mentioned time. We're in a time. I'm wondering, can you help us understand what is the movement, and also tell us the relationship between this current movement and your work?
Yeah, so I'm mindful that there is no moment of racial unrest in the country that did not begin with the police. That the police are sort of like, whether it was Stonewall or whether it was the Watts riots or whatever, like, the police are an integral part of any time that Black people of color, have like taken to the streets and stayed in the streets. And there's something about that I never want to miss. And I worry that people sort of use moments like this and they're like, they sort of care about the police and they go off and do something else. And then they wonder why we're like right back here again really quick. It's because like we haven't actually fixed the cause of the problem, that it's the only rallying thing that like gets people in the street and stay in the street. So when I think about the movement, I never want to dislocate it from that. Like, I think that like I said, I think it goes to the logic of policing in a host of ways that span identity, education, but the institution actually functions so differently in society that is a rallying cry. So when I think about my work, it is about how do we get to zero. Like, I think we can live in a world where the police don't kill people. I think our response to harm and conflict does not need to be somebody with a gun. And I think that the majority of people believe that.
And same question to you, Principal Currie. Can you help us understand what is the movement and the relationship between the current Black movement and your work?
I guess I would define the movement as us making progress toward our ultimate objective. So that would sum up what the movement is. So us working collectively making progress toward our ultimate objective is how I define the movement. I guess my current work is about, investing in young people so that they have the opportunity to live in a world that is where justice is prime. That's what we want to do, and that they are, and let them know that they have help them discover their unique gifts and talents, so they can figure out what place that they play in the movement, and how their personal mission is tied to our collective mission. I think that's what I want to focus on.
I wanted to just chime in here and ask, as a connection to that, if we begin to follow your lead, if we begin to think of ourselves more culturally, and we begin to fight for building our own institutions and things of this nature, what you've been pushing for, what does that look like in 10 or 20 years from now? Where does your vision take us to?
Yeah, so I don't know if 10 or 20 years is enough time, but I envision a place where you would see places, urban communities and Black communities, where there would be institutions that would be run by us, that would be designed by us, that would have us in mind, that would have a Pan-African outlook and be connected to our people all over the world. That are serving our interests in our community. So I'm looking for really more community control. So community control of all institutions. Hopefully we can get there where there's actual community control over the police. So all areas where we are in control and making decisions for ourselves.
And Mr. Mckesson, if we begin to push for equity, pushing for our rights, protesting, and following your lead, the kinds of things you think we need to be doing, what does that look like for us in 10 or 20 years from now, and what does that vision look like for us?
I think 10 or 20 is doable in the sense that if there's anything that we learned from this administration, which there are no good things, but if there's anything I can take away, it is a reminder that the government can move as fast as it wants to when it wants to, right? Who thought we could, again, rip the mailboxes up out the ground? Who thought we could put a Supreme Court justice in like, a couple days? If you remember the tax plan, I'm not being hyperbolic. The tax plan was written on scrap paper. That first tax plan was literally like the last version of it was on scrap paper. You're like, the government can move as quick as it wants to when it wants to. And I think I think before this administration, people always were like, well, everything takes time, da-da-da. And I get that, it is easier to sink a ship than build it. That makes sense to me. And this is definitely a sinking happening right now. But I also know that we could let people out of jail tomorrow. We could invest in public education tomorrow, right? People said there was no money. We found a couple $1 trillion for the pandemic, right? People are like, we can't afford Medicare, Medicaid. A couple $1 trillion came out of nowhere, right? So we could actually do all of the big things really quickly. It is a choice not to do them. It is not a lack of resources. So when I think about 10 years, 20 years, that feels good to me in terms of putting a marker down and saying this is we're fighting to get here. I'm mindful too that the coalition of people, people have been talking about the crime bill and Biden. I'm always mindful. I mean, he wasn't the president, obviously, but the president couldn't do that alone. Trump can't do this alone, right? So for all the ills of his administration, which are many, he is enabled by a Senate that allows it to happen. There's an infrastructure that allows these things to happen. And I'm hopeful that we are building the people on our side, a coalition of people that will never let us backslide, but also will be invested in some of the biggest things so that we can take big leaps forward as opposed to these smaller hops.
Mr. DeRay Mckesson, Principal Neal Currie, thank you for joining us on The Movement.
Thank you for having me.
Good to be here.
To DeRay Mckesson and Principal Neal Currie, thank you for joining us on The Movement. And to you, our viewers, remember to follow us on Facebook at The Movement with Kmt and Kofi. And remember to join us next time on The Movement.